Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through fascinating insights to bring you the knowledge you really need. Today, we're plunging into something that affects so many people, the weight loss journey. And here's something surprising right away. Often, the biggest changes aren't really about the scale. It's something quieter, deeper. We're exploring a transformation that goes way beyond just the physical, especially now with, powerful tools like Semaglutide changing the whole game. But the real eye-opener, our sources suggest, might be figuring out what happens after those intense cravings actually fade. So our deep dive today revolves around the, frankly, incredibly insightful work of Dan Hollis. He's an expert guiding people through the real complexities of weight loss, especially using meds like semaglutide. His whole philosophy, it's so much more than just the prescription. Our mission here is to unpack his view on why that emotional support is just, well, critical, and how we need to redefine success, really, and how to navigate what he calls the quiet window. Okay, let's jump right in. Dan Hollis has this core belief, and it really stood out to me from the sources. Semaglutide isn't the solution, it's the signal.
hmm
He points out that, most programs just give you the syringe, and that's kind of it. But, Dan, he hands you a map. That really struck me because it just pushes back against this idea that the medication itself is the whole fix.
It's a huge distinction, isn't it? And what's so striking is how well Dan captures what many people actually experience. He explains that without that structure and support, the medication can almost amplify the confusion just as much as it turns down the appetite. So, for anyone wondering, semaglutide basically mimics a hormone, GLP-1, right? Helps control appetite, slows digestion, essentially tells your brain, hey, you're full.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the cravings quiet down. That's the mechanism creating the quiet. But, and this is key, if you're not ready for that silence, you're kind of left adrift. It's not enough to just squash a craving. You need to understand what you lost when that craving went away and what you need to build sort of in its place.
That makes me think immediately of what Dan Hollis calls the quiet window. The start often feels pretty straightforward, right? The weight starts coming off, people feel hopeful, that's the goal. But then, like our sources show, something much deeper and, yeah, sometimes pretty unsettling starts to happen. Tell us about that.
Exactly. Yeah. Dan tells a story about a client, Kate. She's 46, busy mom, right? 2 months on semaglutide, 7 pounds down, blood sugar's better on paper, everything looks great, perfect. But then she has this real aha moment. She walked past her pantry and she said, for the first time in maybe 20 years, nothing reached back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nothing reached back. It's kind of wild to think of food not just as, calories or substance, but as a signal you actually miss. What does that tell us about the sort of deeper psychological hooks food might have?
Oh, it tells us basically everything. According to Dan, that right there is the quiet window. It's the exact moment where food stops answering your questions and the real ones start bubbling up.
For Kate C., she didn't miss being hungry. Not really. She missed the rhythm, the familiar pattern, the story she told herself, this routine that for literally decades kind of structured a part of her emotional world. And it's quiet. It can be profoundly unsettling for people because, look, for so many, food wasn't just fuel. It was comfort, maybe control, sometimes even like a core piece of their identity. So, okay, if someone listening is going through this, maybe feeling a bit weird or anxious now that the cravings aren't screaming anymore, that's normal.
Absolutely. 100% normal. Dan confirms this. He actually talks about it almost like a form of grief for some people, the grief of losing the very thing that used to numb you, even if objectively that thing was causing problems. He sees people relapse, he says, not because the drug failed, but because, and this is his quote, no one helped them rebuild the emotional framework that food used to support. Which just hammers home why you need that whole person approach, right? Why just the prescription often isn't enough.
Right, that's powerful. The medicine clears the physical noise, but the emotional stuff is still there, maybe even louder now. So what are some of those real questions that Dan says start talking during this quiet window?
Yeah, Dan's insight here is that semaglutide doesn't actually solve emotional hunger. What it does is it clears the runway so you can finally see what's trying to land. So he guides people to ask themselves some pretty deep questions in that quiet space, like, what am I really hungry for when I'm not hungry for food? Or, who am I without constantly chasing that next meal or snack? What's actually left when all that noise around food cravings just goes quiet? It sounds simple, maybe, but for a lot of people, this is the first time they've ever really sat with questions like these. This quiet, yeah, it's unsettling. But it's also, as he puts it, kind of strangely beautiful. It's a space for real self-discovery.
Okay, so if semaglutide is like hitting a pause button, what are the common ways people mess up when they hit pause? Thinking maybe, that the work is done.
That's a perfect way to phrase it. Dan is really clear. Semaglutide is not a shortcut. It's a pause button, a reset. He says it's a chance to build new systems while the noise gets quiet. But, and this is the big but, only if you know what to do with that silence. So the biggest mistake, it's assuming the drug is the fix instead of just the signal, the opportunity. If you just sort of coast during that pause without actively building new structures, new coping skills, you're really missing the whole point.
Right, which brings up a really critical question probably for a lot of listeners. What about the long run? What happens when you eventually stop taking semaglutide? Because if it's just a pause, like you said, that implies you really need a strategy for after the pause ends.
Precisely. That's a huge question. And it's something Dan tackles head on. He puts it pretty bluntly. If you don't have a strategy, the biology takes over. What he means is, eventually, the appetite signals come back. Old triggers, old habits start calling out louder. And that rebound weight, it can sneak up fast. The body's natural drive to get back to its previous state, its set point, it's incredibly powerful. And that's exactly why he says he never starts someone on these meds without mapping out a clear off-ramp, a solid plan for what comes next. It really loops back to that map idea, doesn't it? It's all about being prepared, having a plan for the whole trip, not just the first leg. You're trying to build a whole new foundation, not just, spackle over some cracks.
Makes total sense. And speaking of the journey itself, you hear this a lot. People get frustrated because maybe they lose weight fast at first, then they hit a wall, they stall out. Why does that happen? And what's Dan's advice for sort of navigating that frustration?
Yeah, that plateau is super common. Dan explains it mostly as the body just adapting. It's smart, right? Really rapid weight loss, even though it feels good initially, can actually trigger your metabolism to slow down. Your body's trying to conserve energy. Sometimes it can even slightly reduce how well the medication works over time. So he really pushes this marathon mindset. You're not here to win the race. You're here to finish it. For instance, if you hit that wall, it might not mean push harder. It might mean adjusting your food, maybe movement, or honestly, sometimes just being patient. The way he approaches it is all about sustainable pacing and patience over that quick, often unsustainable drop, because the real goal is long-term success, flexibility. He talks about pattern mastery over perfection, right? He says, if your system completely freaks out over one slice of cake, you haven't built flexibility. You've just built fear.
Pattern mastery over perfection. That's a really important difference.
Okay, and there's the societal stuff. People saying that using medication like semaglutide for weight loss is, cheating. I bet a lot of listeners have heard that, maybe even thought it. What does Dan say to that?
Oh, yeah, he definitely addresses that. And he has a pretty powerful comeback. He basically says, look, if your body's biochemistry is rigged against you, using science to unrig it isn't cheating, it's adapting. And then he adds, the real cheat is pretending willpower was enough all along. And that just completely reframes it, doesn't it? Away from some kind of moral issue and towards, biological reality. Because for so many people, things like genetics or hormonal stuff like leptin resistance, even your gut bacteria, they can make it a truly massive uphill battle. Willpower alone in that context. It's often just not a fair fight. So using a tool to help rebalance those biological factors isn't taking the easy way out. It's leveling the playing field. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Once the weight is actually off, how do you keep it off? This is like the million-dollar question for anyone who's been through this cycle before, maybe multiple times.
Yeah, the ultimate question, and this is where Dan brings in this idea of identity work.
Yeah.
He argues that the way you keep the weight off is, and this is a great phrase, by becoming the kind of person who doesn't need weight loss as a project anymore. It's less about constant grinding discipline and more about what he calls alignment. It's about slowly, deliberately integrating new habits, new beliefs, new ways of coping until they just feel, normal, part of who you are now. So he defines real success, not just by that number on the scale, but by how many coping mechanisms we've replaced with real tools.
Yeah.
For him, the weight loss itself, it's almost a side effect of clarity. It's about building a new self-story where living healthy isn't a chore, it's just you.
Okay, but what if you're listening to this and you've tried everything, you really feel like you failed every single time? That feeling is just crushing. It's such a common story.
Right. And Dan's view on failure is, honestly, I think, potentially life-changing for people stuck in that cycle. It's so freeing. He basically says, good, that means you've tested what doesn't work. Like, that's valuable data. Then he says, now let's build what does, with tools that actually match your biology, not tools that just shame your behavior. He completely reframes failure. It's not some big final verdict. It's not a reason for shame. He says failure isn't the end. It's a message, a moment of feedback. And he adds, Sometimes it's the most honest conversation you'll ever have with yourself.
So instead of beating yourself up when you slip up, the idea is to get curious. What does that actually look like?
It's exactly curiosity over judgment. He makes the point that a relapse or going off track, it isn't some betrayal of all your progress. Often it's just the brain asking for that old familiar comfort zone, that well-worn neural pathway. So when setbacks happen, the key is to approach them like a detective almost. Ask, okay, why did I reach for that? What was I feeling? What need wasn't being met?
Mm.
As he puts it, the shame isn't in failing. The shame is in pretending you were supposed to be perfect all along. This fosters a way more compassionate and, frankly, more effective way forward. You replace the self-blame with self-inquiry, with practical problem solving. It's about giving yourself like the scaffolding and the momentum to rebuild, not just banking on willpower or motivation, which, let's be honest, comes and goes.
Okay, so let's wrap this up for you, the listener. What does this all mean? To recap, our deep dive into Dan Hollis's perspective shows that while meds like semaglutide are definitely powerful tools, that pause button he talks about, they're really just the start. Real lasting change seems to demand that map, that strategy for the deep emotional and identity work that comes next.
Uh-huh. And critically, it's about learning how to navigate and actually use the quiet window.
Mm.
That emotional space that opens up when the food cravings quiet down. It's not this scary void. It's actually a huge opportunity, an opportunity for some deep self-discovery, for rebuilding your relationship with yourself and figuring out what you're really hungry for beyond food.
And maybe the biggest takeaway. Dan Hollis offers this truly transformative view on failure. It's not some sign of weakness, it's valuable data. It's a message telling you something important for learning and growing. It's about, failing forward, not just failing. Using every single experience to build a stronger, more resilient you.
Yeah. And, if Dan Hollis could talk to your past self, maybe on day one of any new health journey you've started, he might just say this: slow down. Look, this isn't punishment. This is repair. Trust the process, sure, but maybe more importantly, stay in relationship with yourself while you do it. Really listen to what that quiet window has to tell you.
That's a really beautiful and I think incredibly important final thought. It really makes you pause and reflect, doesn't it? How do you define success and failure in your own life? And maybe what quiet windows are waiting right now for you to just listen in, to really hear yourself again, maybe for the first time in a while, beyond all the noise. We really hope this deep dive has given you some powerful new ways to think about your own journey.